Well, library affectation in my life was pronounced and deep. I grew up in Litchfield, Connecticut, and our library was the Oliver Wilcott Library, which was about a mile from my house. And I spent more time there almost than I spent in school. I went there every single day after school. And it was my babysitter. It was the hub of my social life. I had my first kiss on the stone wall outside the library. I learned to read in that library. So the first word I ever read was the word red, R-E-D, and it was in a book of Swedish fairy tales that my mom had gotten out of the library, and she was reading it to me. And I remember sitting on her lap, and all of a sudden that word just grew out of the page at me, and it just looked familiar. And I said, "Does that say red?" And I remember her being very excited. She said, "Yes, you just read a word." And that was a big breakthrough, like the Rosetta Stone for me in my life. And then when I became an adult and I moved to New York City and I was working to become a short story writer and a novelist, I wrote at the New York Public Library about 5 days a week. And that was my refuge. I lived in a tiny apartment, crowded and loud, and there was no privacy, and I would go to that great room in the New York Public Library, and I wrote my first 2 books there. So I cannot overstate the importance of libraries in my life. Mrs. Buckland and Mrs. Cooley, they were the librarians of my childhood. Mrs. Buckland was young and pretty and blonde and wore miniskirts, which I thought was very scandalous at the time. And Mrs. Cooley looked exactly as one would picture a librarian looking. They were just extremely kind, and they always had something new, and they had just the right amount of discipline and also the sense of liberty of exploring the stacks, and I adored them both. And I love it when people, it's funny because people always apologize when they come to a reading and they don't have my book to sign, and they'll say, "I'm really sorry I didn't buy your book, but I read it at the library," and I just want to kiss them and say, "You should never apologize to me for getting books out of a library. You know, this is one of the fundamental aspects of civilization. Bravo, I'm delighted for you." So I've heard that some of my books are on waiting lists, which is always a very sweet feeling as well.